Edgar Mitchell was 38 hours into his return from the moon. The spacecraft was rotating slowly, the way it always did on the journey home, and through the window, the view kept changing. Earth, stars, moon, Earth, stars, moon. The same three objects cycling past in silence. And then something happened that Mitchell could not explain and spent the rest of his life trying to. He described it as an instant of knowing, not a thought, not a realization, something that arrived complete, all at once, without any intellectual process leading up to it. The feeling that everything he was looking at, the Earth, the moon, the stars, the spacecraft, himself, was part of a single living system. That the separation between things was not real. That the universe was in some way conscious of itself, and that he was one of the ways it was doing that. Mitchell was a Navy pilot, an MIT-trained engineer, a man selected by NASA precisely for his rationality and composure. He was not prone to mystical experiences. He had not expected this, and when he landed and tried to describe it, he found that the language for it already existed. In the writings of mystics, in Eastern philosophy, in accounts of experiences that had been described for centuries under the name of Samadhi, or cosmic consciousness. Experiences that meditators and monks have reportedly spent decades trying to reach. Mitchell had apparently arrived there accidentally, going 25,000 miles per hour, 38 hours from the moon. He spent the rest of his career trying to understand what had happened to him. He founded an institute to study it. He gave hundreds of interviews, and he was not alone. The overview effect is the name given to the cognitive shift reported by astronauts who have seen the Earth from space. Not all of them experience it in the same way or to the same degree, but the pattern is consistent enough, and the accounts striking enough, that it has become one of the most studied and least understood phenomena in the psychology of space exploration. The term was coined in 1987 by a writer named Frank White, who interviewed dozens of astronauts and found that their experiences of Earth from orbit shared a common structure: a sudden, overwhelming awareness of the planet as a whole, a loss of the sense that national borders, conflicts, or differences between people were real or significant, a feeling of profound interconnection, and, almost universally, a changed relationship with the Earth itself, not as a backdrop to human life, but as a living entity, fragile, inspecific, and irreplaceable. Ron Garan, who spent 178 days aboard the International Space Station, described looking down at the planet and feeling what he called orbital perspective, a visceral awareness of the contradiction between the beauty of what he was seeing and the suffering he knew was happening on its surface at that exact moment. People going hungry, wars being fought, resources being destroyed, all of it invisible from orbit, all of it happening on the most beautiful object he had ever seen. He said the experience changed how he thought about every problem he encountered afterward. Chris Hadfield, who commanded the ISS and spent months photographing the Earth from orbit, described the view as physiologically different from any other view he had ever experienced. Not just visually, physically. Something in the body changes, he said, when you see the planet from outside it for the first time. The scale, the color, the clarity, the thinness of the atmosphere visible at the edge, all of it producing a response that was not purely cognitive, something in the nervous system responding to a view it had never been built to see. And this is where the science becomes genuinely interesting, because it turns out the human nervous system was not built to see the Earth from outside it, and what happens when it does appears to involve something much deeper than a change of perspective. The human brain processes visual information against a set of expectations built up over an entire lifetime. You know how big the Earth is. You know what it looks like from maps, from photographs, from an entire life of being on it. But none of that preparation does what actually seeing it from orbit does. The brain, confronted with a view it has no framework to process, appears to respond in a way that is closer to an emotional or spiritual event than a cognitive one. Researchers studying the neurological basis of the overview effect have pointed to a phenomenon called the sublime, a response identified by philosophers going back to Edmund Burke in the 18th century. The experience of something so vast that the mind cannot fully contain it, so large that the normal categories of perception break down. The feeling, as Burke described it, of astonishing terror and beauty arriving simultaneously, producing a response that is neither purely emotional nor purely intellectual, but something that seems to operate at a level deeper than either. The Earth, from orbit, is, by any measure, an experience of the sublime. And what the sublime does to the brain, neurologically, appears to involve a temporary disruption of the default mode network, the set of brain regions associated with self-referential thinking, with the sense of being a bounded individual separate from the world. When the default mode network quiets, the boundary between self and world becomes less distinct. The sense of being a separate thing, located here, distinct from everything else, loosens. And what floods in when that loosening happens is something that people across cultures and centuries have described in remarkably similar terms: a sense of unity, of belonging, of everything being connected and the separation being, in some important way, not real. This is the same network that quiets during deep meditation, the same network that is disrupted by certain psychedelic compounds, the same network whose activity is reduced in the experiences that mystics have been describing for thousands of years. What astronauts appear to be experiencing, neurologically, is something that shares a deep structural similarity with the states that contemplative traditions have been deliberately cultivating for millennia. The philosopher David Yaden at Johns Hopkins has been studying what he calls self-transcendent experiences, moments in which the normal sense of individual selfhood temporarily dissolves into something larger. His research has found that these experiences, whether triggered by meditation, by psychedelics, by near-death events, or by profound encounters with nature, share a common neurological signature, and the accounts from astronauts fit that signature almost exactly. Yaden argues that the overview effect is not a metaphor or a poetic description of a nice view. It is a genuine altered state of consciousness, one triggered not by a substance or a practice, but by a specific visual and spatial experience that the human brain was simply not designed to have. Seeing your entire planet from outside it as a single object floating in darkness appears to be one of the most reliable triggers of self-transcendent experience that exists. The astronaut Michael Collins, who orbited the moon alone in the command module while Armstrong and Aldrin walked on the surface, described the Earth from that distance as so small he could cover it with his thumb. He held his thumb up and the entire planet disappeared behind it. And he said that what he felt was not smallness or insignificance. He felt something closer to the opposite, a sense that everything he cared about, everything that had ever mattered to anyone, was visible in that small circle of light, concentrated there, precious in a way that its scale didn't diminish, but somehow intensified. This is one of the most consistent paradoxes in astronaut accounts of the overview effect. The Earth seen from space looks small. The rational mind knows this means it is small, a rocky planet, one of 8, orbiting an average star in an ordinary galaxy among hundreds of billions. And yet, almost no astronaut reports feeling that the Earth is diminished by this view. Almost all of them report feeling that it is more precious than they had imagined, more fragile, more worth protecting. The smallness, rather than reducing the significance of what they are looking at, seems to intensify it. Frank White, who coined the term, believes this is the core psychological mechanism of the overview effect, that seeing the whole changes your relationship to the parts, that when you can see the entire system at once, the entire planet, the entire atmosphere, the entire thin blue line between the surface and the void, you understand it as a system in a way that is simply not available to you from inside it. The way you cannot understand the shape of a city by walking its streets. You have to rise above it. You have to see it whole. And here is what makes this more than philosophically interesting, because the overview effect does not stay in orbit. Astronauts come back, and what they come back with appears, in a significant number of cases, to be something that persists. Ron Garan became an advocate for what he called orbital perspective as a framework for problem solving on Earth. The idea that seeing problems from above, as a whole system, changes what solutions seem possible. Edgar Mitchell founded an institute and spent decades researching consciousness. Rusty Schweickart, who conducted a spacewalk on Apollo 9 and found himself floating outside the spacecraft with nothing between him and the void, returned to become one of the most committed advocates for planetary protection, spending years working on the problem of asteroid defense, not as a hobby, as what he described as a direct consequence of what he had seen. The psychiatrist Justin Feinstein, who studies emotion and the body, has suggested that the overview effect may involve a form of emotional recalibration, a resetting of the emotional baseline in response to an experience so outside ordinary human parameters that the brain is forced to revise its fundamental assumptions about scale, significance, and connection. The experience doesn't just change what astronauts think, it appears to change what they feel, by default, for the rest of their lives. There are currently approximately 600 people who have been to space, out of a species of 8 billion, which means that fewer than 1 in 10 million humans has ever had the direct direct experience of seeing the Earth from outside it. The overview effect, if it is what the accounts suggest, is one of the rarest experiences available to a member of our species. And almost everyone who has had it comes back saying some version of the same thing, that the view changes something, that something in the brain or the body or whatever you want to call the self is permanently reorganized by the encounter with that specific image. Your planet, whole, from outside it, floating in black. Edgar Mitchell, who started all of this with his moment of knowing on the way home from the moon, spent 30 years trying to explain what had happened to him. He never fully succeeded, not because he wasn't articulate about it, but because the experience kept pointing at something that language was not quite built to carry. The closest he ever got, in interview after interview, was this: that what he had seen from the spacecraft window was not a view of the Earth. It was a view of a system. And from inside a system, you cannot see it. You can only see it from outside. Most of us will never leave this planet. We will live our entire lives inside the system, unable to see its shape from where we stand. But something about the accounts of the people who have seen it from outside, the consistency, the intensity, the fact that it keeps happening to pilots and engineers and military veterans, people not selected for mystical sensitivity, people who didn't expect it, suggests that the experience is doing something real, something neurological, something that the brain responds to not as a nice view, but as a fundamental reorganization of what is real and what matters, and where you end and everything else begins. The overview effect is waiting, apparently, for anyone who makes it far enough, and it arrives without warning, and it does not fully leave.